In 1945, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were driven toward a mangrove swamp. The story says the swamp was waiting for them. Saltwater crocodiles, screams in the dark, almost 1,000 men gone by morning. But this case has a problem. The battle was real. The swamp was real. The crocodiles were real. But was the massacre? Did crocodiles really kill hundreds of soldiers on Ramree Island? Or did history take a battlefield disaster and blame the most frightening thing in the water? Receipts first, verdict later. Before we put the crocodiles on trial, we need to ask why those soldiers were in the swamp at all. Ramree Island sits off the coast of Burma, now Myanmar, along the Arakan coast. In early 1945, the Second World War was moving toward its final months. Germany was collapsing in Europe, but in Asia, Japanese forces were still fighting across Burma. To the Allies, Ramree was not just another muddy island on a map. It mattered. Capturing Ramree and nearby Chiduba Island could help support the inland campaign with air bases and supply routes. So, on 21st of January 1945, troops of the 26th Indian Division landed on Ramree. British and Indian forces came ashore. Japanese troops resisted, and what began as a military operation would later become one of the most repeated animal attack stories in history. That first receipt matters. This was not born as a campfire monster story. It started as a battle for territory, a battle for movement, a battle fought by real men in one of the hardest theatres of war. But once the crocodile legend takes over, the battlefield almost disappears. The mud disappears, the hunger disappears, the disease disappears, the gunfire disappears, and all that remains is teeth. Before the receipts come in, what is your first verdict? Was Ramree a real crocodile massacre? Was it an exaggerated legend? Or was it somewhere in between? Drop real, exaggerated, or messy in the comments, because with this case, messy may be exactly where the truth lives. By February, the story was no longer just about who could hold the island, it was about who could get off it alive. As Allied pressure increased, Japanese troops on Ramree were being squeezed. Their position was becoming harder to hold. Their escape route led through water, mud, tidal channels, and mangrove swamp. That swamp would become the crime scene in the legend, but it was not just crocodile territory. It was a place where almost everything could kill you. The mangroves were dense, the mud could slow a man down until every step became work, the water rose and fell with the tides. Clean drinking water was hard to find. Food was limited. Mosquitoes, infection, exhaustion, snakes, and exposure all belonged to the same landscape. And yes, so did crocodiles. Saltwater crocodiles are not folklore. They are not misunderstood swamp puppies. They are massive ambush predators, and in the right conditions, absolutely capable of killing people. So the crocodile part of this story cannot just be laughed away. A swamp with saltwater crocodiles is dangerous. A group of exhausted soldiers trying to move through it at night is in serious trouble. But danger is not the same thing as proof. That is where Ramree splits in two. On one side, the historical battle. On the other, the legend. The legend says hundreds of Japanese soldiers went into the swamp and barely anyone came out. The legend says crocodiles did the killing. The legend gives the story one clean villain. But the real swamp was not clean. The swamp had more than one killer. And then came the version of the story that turned a military retreat into one of the most infamous animal attacks ever told. The famous version of Ramree is almost impossible to forget once you hear it. Japanese soldiers trapped in the mangroves, crocodiles moving through the dark, rifle shots, screams, bodies disappearing into black water, and by morning, according to the legend, only a handful survived. That version has everything a terrifying story needs. War, night, a trapped enemy, a silent swamp, and predators that look like they crawled out of another age. The story was helped along by later retellings, especially an account connected to Bruce Stanley Wright, a Canadian naturalist and wartime officer. Wright wrote about the events after the war, and his description helped give the Crocodile Massacre story a kind of authority. That matters, because when a terrifying animal story comes from someone who understands wildlife, people are more likely to believe it. The tale was repeated, then repeated again. It entered books, articles, documentaries, and record book legend. For a time, Ramree was treated as one of the deadliest animal attacks ever recorded. But a vivid story is not the same thing as a complete investigation. A repeated number is not the same thing as a proven death toll. And a crocodile in the swamp is not automatically guilty of every death that happened there. The famous version has problems. First, the number. Hundreds of men supposedly killed by crocodiles in a short period. That is the part that makes the story famous. It is also the part that causes the most trouble. Second, the source trail. The legend leans heavily on later accounts and retellings, not on a neat stack of military reports saying crocodiles killed hundreds of soldiers. Third, the ecology. For the biggest version of the story to work, the swamp almost has to become a machine of crocodile predation. Predator after predator after predator, all attacking humans in one massive feeding event. It is unforgettable, but unforgettable does not mean proven. Saltwater crocodiles are dangerous. They can kill people, but saying crocodiles killed some men is very different from saying crocodiles massacred hundreds. And once that difference opens up, the case changes, because the crocodiles are no longer the only suspects. If crocodiles did not kill hundreds of Japanese soldiers, then what did? The answer is uglier, less cinematic, and probably closer to the truth. War killed them, water killed them, disease killed them, exhaustion killed them, hunger killed them, gunfire killed them, drowning killed them. The swamp did not need one monster, it had a whole system of death. By the time Japanese soldiers were trying to escape Ramree, many were likely already in terrible condition. They were cut off, they were under pressure, they had limited supplies, they were moving through brutal terrain. A man weakened by hunger, dehydration, wounds, malaria, dysentery, or exhaustion does not need a crocodile to finish him. A tidal swamp can do that, a failed crossing can do that, enemy fire can do that, panic can do that. And this is where the legend becomes too simple. It takes a battlefield disaster and gives it an animal face. That does not mean the crocodiles were innocent. This is not a clean acquittal. Saltwater crocodiles were present. Some attacks may have happened. Some Japanese soldiers may very well have died in crocodile jaws. But that is not the same thing as saying crocodiles were the main cause of hundreds of deaths. The smaller claim is plausible. The larger claim is where the receipts start to fall apart, and the numbers matter. Because once the story says almost 1,000 men were eaten, it changes what the event means. It turns military defeat into predator legend. It turns many causes of death into one suspect. It turns the swamp into a courtroom, and the crocodile into the accused. But this case does not have one answer. It has mud, it has hunger, it has gunfire, it has disease, it has drowning, it has fear, and yes, it has crocodiles. The swamp had more than one killer. So how did one predator become the headline for an entire battlefield disaster? The Crocodile Story won because it is easier to remember. That sounds cold, but it is true. History does not always keep the most accurate version. Sometimes it keeps the version with the sharpest teeth. Soldiers died from exposure, disease, hunger, drowning, gunfire, and possibly some crocodile attacks. Maybe closer to reality, but it is not clean. It does not fit neatly on a thumbnail. It does not become a campfire story. Crocodiles ate an army does. That version has shape. It has horror. It has a villain. And it gives the swamp a personality. That is why animal blame stories survive. They take messy human events and turn them into something people can point at. A village is afraid, name a beast. A child disappears, blame a dingo. A seaside town panics, blame one shark. A battlefield becomes a nightmare, blame the crocodiles. The crocodiles were the most frightening part of the Ramree story, so they became the part people remembered. That does not mean the story came from nothing. The strongest legends usually grow around something real. There was a battle, there was a retreat, there was a swamp, there were crocodiles, there were deaths. But between some men may have been killed by crocodiles and crocodiles massacred hundreds, there is a huge gap, and that gap is where myth lives. The more often the story was repeated, the cleaner it became. The other causes faded, the crocodiles stayed, but the verdict lands. What do you think? Are the crocodiles guilty of the massacre, or were they overcharged by history? Comment guilty if you think the legend basically holds up. Comment overcharged if you think crocodiles were involved, but blamed for too much. And if you enjoy these animal case files, hit like and subscribe so this little swamp investigation actually escapes the algorithm with all limbs attached. Because now it is time for the verdict. So what is the verdict on the World War II crocodile massacre at Ramree Island? Not innocent, not guilty of the full legend either. The Ramree crocodile massacre was not invented from nothing. The battle was real, the retreat was real, the swamp was dangerous, saltwater crocodiles were there, and some men may well have died in their jaws. But the famous version asks the evidence to carry more weight than it can hold. Hundreds of men eaten in one night, almost 1,000 men wiped out mainly by crocodiles. That is the part the receipts cannot prove. The crocodiles were dangerous, but they were not the only danger. They may have killed some soldiers, but the swamp, the war, the water, the disease, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the gunfire almost certainly carried more of the case than the legend admits. The cleaner story blamed the crocodiles. The messier truth points to something bigger. A battlefield disaster, a brutal escape route, a terrifying environment, and a public memory that remembered the teeth better than the receipts. Final verdict? Crocodiles involved. Massacre claim? Unproven. The swamp had more than one killer, and if you want another case where one predator was blamed for a much bigger public panic, watch the 1916 Jersey Shore shark panic next. 5 attacks, 4 dead, 1 shark blamed. But, just like Ramree, the real case is much messier than the legend. Receipts first, verdict later.